The jungle screamed with the whistle of incoming artillery as Marine Private First Class Johnny Mitchell pressed his face into the muddy earth of Henderson Field. It was October 15th, 1942, and the fate of the entire Pacific. War hung in the balance on this god-forsaken island called Guadalcanal. Above him, Japanese bombers droned like mechanical vultures, their shadows dancing across the contested airstrip that had become the most valuable piece of real estate in the Pacific theater. Mitchell had arrived with the 1st Marine Division. Just 2 months earlier, part of Operation Watchtower, the first major Allied offensive against the Japanese Empire. What was supposed to be a quick seizure of an unfinished airfield had transformed into a grinding campaign of attrition that would test American resolve like nothing before. The Marines had caught the Japanese by surprise on August 7th, 1942, landing on the northern beaches of Guadalcanal with little initial resistance. The enemy construction workers had fled so hastily they left behind hot meals and warm sake. But that honeymoon period had ended swiftly. Within days, the Japanese Navy had struck back with devastating force at the Battle of Savo Island, sinking 4 Allied cruisers in a night action so complete that it left the Marines stranded on the island with limited supplies and no naval protection. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's transport ships had fled, leaving behind 17,000 Marines to face whatever the Japanese Empire could throw at them. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, The Struggle. For Guadalcanal, the strategic importance of this single airfield could not be overstated. Henderson Field, named after Major Lofton Henderson, who died at Midway, represented the furthest penetration of American forces into the Japanese defensive perimeter. From this base, Allied aircraft could interdict Japanese supply lines to Australia and New Zealand while providing air cover for future offensive operations up the Solomon Islands chain. The Japanese understood this reality with crystal clarity. Emperor Hirohito himself had declared that Guadalcanal must be retaken at all costs. General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army was being assembled for a massive counteroffensive, while Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet prowled the surrounding waters like a pack of wolves. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether American industrial might could overcome Japanese military excellence and fanatical determination. Mitchell rolled over in his foxhole as another bomb exploded nearby, showering him with coral fragments and rotting vegetation. The stench of the jungle mixed with cordite and death created an atmosphere of surreal horror that no training could have prepared him for. Dysentery and malaria were claiming almost as many casualties as enemy bullets, while the constant rain turned every position into a quagmire of mud and misery. Yet something had changed in the American fighting spirit since Pearl Harbor. The easy victories of the Japanese advance had been halted at the Coral Sea and shattered at Midway. Now, on this steaming island in the middle of nowhere, a new generation of American warriors was learning that they could not only match the feared Japanese soldier, but defeat him. The myth of Japanese invincibility was about to die in the jungles of Guadalcanal, one bloody foxhole at a time. Colonel James Doolittle's raiders had established a defensive perimeter around Henderson Field, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the Japanese launched their major counterattack. The intelligence reports were ominous. Enemy reinforcements were streaming down from Rabaul on fast destroyers and cruisers under cover of darkness, a supply run the Marines grimly nicknamed the Tokyo Express. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty, Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines had arrived as reinforcement in early September, but even their presence couldn't mask the precarious nature of the American position. The perimeter was stretched thin, with gaps that could only be covered by constant patrols and the hope that Japanese infiltration tactics wouldn't succeed in the crucial sectors. The first major test came on September 12th through 14th, when Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's reinforced battalion launched a night assault across the Tanaru River. Ichiki, a veteran of the China campaign, was supremely confident that his battle-hardened troops could overwhelm what he perceived as soft American Marines. He was catastrophically wrong. The Marines had prepared interlocking fields of fire with machine guns and artillery, turning the river crossing into a killing ground. Private Mitchell found himself manning a .30 caliber machine gun when the Japanese attack commenced at 2 o'clock in the morning. The enemy came in waves, shouting banzai charges that spoke more of desperate courage than tactical wisdom. American illumination rounds turned night into day, revealing Japanese soldiers, advancing with fixed bayonets across open ground. It was slaughter, pure and simple, but Mitchell couldn't help but admire the incredible bravery of men who continued advancing into certain death. By dawn, over 800 Japanese bodies littered the approaches to Henderson Field. Colonel Ichiki, unable to bear the shame of defeat, committed ritual suicide rather than report his failure to higher command. The Battle of the Tanaru had demonstrated that American Marines, properly positioned and supplied, could inflict devastating casualties on attacking Japanese forces. However, the victory came at a cost that extended far beyond immediate battle casualties. The Japanese High Command, rather than recognizing the futility of frontal assaults against prepared positions, doubled down on their commitment to retake Guadalcanal. General Hyakutake began concentrating the 17th Army for what he promised would be the decisive battle of the Pacific War. Meanwhile, the logistical situation for the Americans remained desperate. Supplies could only reach Henderson Field during daylight hours, when Allied air cover could protect the transport ships. Every night brought the Tokyo Express, Japanese destroyers and cruisers that would shell the airfield with impunity before racing back to their bases before dawn. The Marines learned to time their lives around these nightly bombardments, diving into bunkers and foxholes as the first enemy shells began falling. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford, as the constant threat of night attacks kept everyone on edge. Disease continued to ravage both sides, with malaria and dysentery claiming victims regardless of nationality. The wounded faced an uncertain fate, as medical evacuations were often impossible during periods of heavy combat. Yet something remarkable was happening among the American forces. The shared hardship was forging bonds that would last lifetimes, while the constant proximity to death was revealing reserves of courage that many Marines never knew they possessed. Henderson Field was becoming more than just an airstrip. It was becoming a symbol of American determination to fight and win, regardless of the odds. October brought the Japanese build-up to its climax as General Hyakutake assembled over 20,000 troops for what Imperial headquarters designated as the decisive battle for Guadalcanal. The plan was ambitious in scope. Simultaneous attacks from multiple directions would overwhelm the thin Marine perimeter, while naval forces eliminated Henderson Field through sustained bombardment. The prelude to this offensive came on October 11th, when Rear Admiral Norman Scott's Task Force 64 intercepted a Japanese cruiser squadron near Cape Esperance. In the confused night action that followed, Scott's ships managed to sink one Japanese cruiser and heavily damage two others, proving that American naval forces could compete with the feared Japanese Navy in surface combat. However, the strategic situation remained desperate as enemy reinforcements continued pouring onto the island. Lieutenant Colonel Puller's battalion found itself assigned to defend a critical ridge position south of Henderson Field, a piece of high ground that would soon earn the nickname Bloody Ridge. The Japanese had identified this terrain as the key to breaking through the Marine perimeter, and they were prepared to pay any price to seize it. The attack commenced on October 24th, with the most intense artillery bombardment the Marines had yet experienced. Japanese 150mm howitzers, carefully positioned in the jungle, pounded American positions with mathematical precision. Private Mitchell, now a squad leader, watched in fascination as enemy shells systematically destroyed every piece of cover his men had constructed over the previous weeks. But the artillery was merely the overture to the main event. As darkness fell, the jungle came alive with the sounds of advancing infantry. The Japanese had learned from their earlier failures at the Tenarú River. This time they would use stealth and infiltration rather than frontal assault. Small groups of enemy soldiers slipped through gaps in the marine lines, creating chaos and confusion in the rear areas. The fighting that ensued defied description. Hand-to-hand combat in pitch darkness, with Marines and Japanese soldiers grappling for weapons in foxholes filled with mud and blood. The distinctive crack of the Japanese Arisaka rifle mixed with the heavier boom of American Garons, while grenades exploded with deadly frequency in the confined spaces of the jungle fighting. Puller's Marines held their ground through sheer determination and superior firepower, but the cost was terrible. Companies were reduced to platoon strength, while platoons became squads. The wounded crawled to aid stations that were themselves under constant attack, and the dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. On October 25th, the Japanese made their supreme effort. 3 full battalions, supported by tanks, launched a coordinated assault against the ridge position. The Marine artillery, down to its last few rounds of ammunition, fired over open sights at point-blank range. Machine gunners continued firing, until their barrels glowed red-hot, while riflemen husbanded every cartridge like precious gems. The crisis reached its peak just before dawn, when Japanese soldiers actually penetrated the Marine command post. Puller himself grabbed a rifle and joined the desperate fight to prevent a complete breakthrough. For 20 minutes, the outcome hung in balance as individual acts of heroism determined whether Henderson Field would remain in American hands. When the sun rose on October 26th, over 2,000 Japanese bodies carpeted the approaches to Bloody Ridge. General Hyakutake's great offensive had failed, but the Marines who survived the battle were changed forever. They had looked into the abyss of defeat and found within themselves the strength to prevail. The failure of the October offensive only intensified Japanese determination to retake Guadalcanal through naval power. Admiral Yamamoto assembled the most powerful fleet since Midway, including the massive battleships Hiei and Kirishima, for what he promised would be the final elimination of Henderson Field and its defending garrison. The resulting naval battles of mid-November 1942 would prove to be among the most savage and decisive of the entire Pacific War. On the night of November 12th through 13th, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's cruiser force intercepted the Japanese bombardment fleet in the confined waters off Savo Island. What followed was a point-blank naval brawl that destroyed the traditional concepts of fleet engagement. Private Mitchell, now promoted to sergeant after losses among the non-commissioned officers, watched the distant flashes of naval gunfire from his position overlooking Henderson Field. The entire northern horizon flickered with explosions as American and Japanese warships hammered each other at ranges so close that torpedo attacks became impossible due to insufficient arming distance. The first night's action cost both sides heavily. Admiral Callahan died aboard his flagship, the cruiser San Francisco, while the Japanese lost the battleship Hiei to concentrated American fire. But the strategic situation remained unchanged. Japanese reinforcements continued landing while American supply ships struggled to reach the beleaguered garrison. 2 nights later, the naval drama reached its climax when the Japanese returned with the battleship Kirishima and a powerful escort force. This time, Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee's Task Force 64, built around the new battleships Washington and South Dakota, met them in the confined waters between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. The Battle of the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal became a testament to American industrial supremacy and tactical evolution. The South Dakota suffered severe damage from Japanese cruiser fire, but the Washington's radar-directed guns found their target with devastating accuracy. The Kirishima, pride of the Japanese battle line, was reduced to a blazing wreck in less than 20 minutes of engagement. As referenced in Richard Frank's comprehensive study, Guadalcanal, the Definitive Account, these November naval battles marked the turning point of the entire campaign. The Japanese Navy, which had dominated Pacific waters since Pearl Harbor, suddenly found itself unable to protect its own supply lines while preventing American reinforcement of Henderson Field. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. Japanese sailors, accustomed to victory through superior training and tactics, discovered that American technology and industrial capacity were beginning to tip the balance. New radar systems allowed American ships to fight effectively at night, while improved damage control procedures kept battle-damaged vessels in action long enough to complete their missions. For the Americans, the November victories provided proof that their expanding fleet could meet and defeat the finest naval force in the world. The myth of Japanese invincibility at sea, carefully cultivated through victories at Pearl Harbor, Java Sea, and dozens of smaller engagements, lay in ruins alongside the burning hulk of the Kirishima. But the real beneficiaries of these naval victories were the Marines defending Henderson Field. With Japanese supply lines effectively severed, enemy forces on Guadalcanal began experiencing the same logistical difficulties that had plagued American forces during the campaign's early months. The Tokyo Express continued its nightly runs, but destroyers and cruisers could carry only limited supplies compared to the transport ships that American naval superiority now made possible. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted, though few participants recognized it at the time. What had begun as a desperate American gamble to seize a single airfield had evolved into a campaign that would prove American capacity to fight and win extended operations against the Japanese Empire. By December 1942, the character of the Guadalcanal campaign had fundamentally changed from desperate defense to methodical attrition. The Japanese High Command, finally recognizing the impossibility of retaking Henderson Field through direct assault, began planning for a strategic withdrawal while maintaining face through continued resistance. General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps had relieved the exhausted 1st Marine Division, bringing fresh troops and abundant supplies to what was now a secure American base. The arrival of the Army's 25th Infantry Division and additional Marine units meant that American forces on Guadalcanal now outnumbered their Japanese opponents by more than 2-1. Sergeant Mitchell, one of the few original Marines, still serving with his unit, found himself training replacement troops who seemed impossibly young and naive. The transformation in American military capability over just 6 months was remarkable. What had once been a desperate improvisation was now a well-supplied and professionally managed operation. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced an impossible strategic situation. General Hyakutake's 17th Army was slowly starving as American air and naval power interdicted supply lines with increasing effectiveness. Disease continued its relentless toll, while ammunition shortages forced Japanese commanders to husband their resources for purely defensive operations. Yet the enemy showed no signs of surrender or collapse. Japanese defensive positions, expertly camouflaged and mutually supporting, turned every advance into a costly affair. American forces learned to respect their opponent's skill in defensive warfare while developing new tactics for reducing fortified positions in jungle terrain. The battle for Mount Austin exemplified this new phase of the campaign. Rising 2,000 feet above Henderson Field, this jungle-covered peak provided the Japanese with observation posts and artillery positions that could harass American operations. The 25th Infantry Division's assault on these positions beginning in late December demonstrated both the evolution of American tactical doctrine and the continuing effectiveness of Japanese defensive techniques. Infantry battalions, supported by artillery and close air support, methodically reduced one defensive position after another. The fighting was no less intense than during the desperate battles of August and September, but now American forces possessed the resources and experience necessary to sustain prolonged operations. Japanese resistance, while skillful and determined, could no longer prevent American advances through superior tactics alone. The logistical transformation was equally dramatic. Henderson Field had evolved from a barely functional fighter strip into a major air base capable of supporting heavy bombers and transport aircraft. American engineers had constructed roads, hospitals, supply depots, and communication facilities that rivaled those found in established military bases throughout the Pacific. This infrastructure development had strategic implications that extended far beyond Guadalcanal itself. The island was becoming a staging area for future operations up the Solomon Islands chain, while its airfields provided bases for long-range reconnaissance and bombing missions against Japanese installations throughout the region. The human cost of this transformation remained staggering. American battle casualties exceeded 7,000, while disease had claimed additional thousands more. The psychological toll on survivors was equally severe, as months of combat in tropical conditions had pushed many veterans to the limits of human endurance. But something remarkable had emerged from this crucible of suffering and death. The American military had learned to fight and win against the most formidable enemy it had ever faced. Tactics, equipment, and leadership had all evolved under the pressure of combat, creating a fighting force that was qualitatively different from the peacetime military that had entered the war 12 months earlier. The Japanese, recognizing this transformation, began serious planning for evacuation of their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. The decision represented a fundamental shift in Japanese strategic thinking. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Imperial Headquarters was planning withdrawal rather than advance. The new year of 1943 brought the final phase of the Guadalcanal campaign as Imperial General Headquarters authorized Operation KE. The evacuation of surviving Japanese forces from what they now privately acknowledged was an untenable position. The decision represented a psychological watershed in the Pacific War. Japan's first major strategic retreat since beginning its expansion in China 6 years earlier. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, personally supervised the evacuation planning with characteristic attention to detail. Fast destroyers and submarines would evacuate approximately 13,000 troops over 3 nights, while diversionary attacks would conceal Japanese intentions from American intelligence. The operation required precise timing and exceptional seamanship, qualities the Japanese Navy still possessed, despite its recent defeats. General Patch's forces, meanwhile, prepared for what they assumed would be a final decisive battle to eliminate remaining Japanese resistance. American intelligence had detected increased enemy naval activity, but interpreted it as preparation for another reinforcement effort rather than evacuation. This misreading of Japanese intentions would allow Operation KE to achieve complete tactical surprise. Sergeant Mitchell, now commanding a rifle platoon due to continuing casualties among officers, led his men in preparing for what everyone expected to be the climactic assault on Japanese defensive positions. The 25th Infantry Division had spent weeks reducing enemy strongpoints on Mount Austin, while Marine units prepared to advance along the northern coast toward Cape Esperance. The first indication that something unusual was happening came on the night of February 1st, when Japanese destroyers appeared off Guadalcanal in greater numbers than any previous Tokyo Express run. American PT boats and aircraft attacked the evacuation fleet, but their efforts were hampered by weather and the confusion inherent in night combat. Unknown to the Americans, over 4,000 Japanese soldiers were successfully evacuated during this single operation. 2 nights later, the pattern repeated with even greater success. Japanese destroyers, operating with clockwork precision, embarked troops from carefully prepared positions and disappeared into the darkness before American forces could mount effective countermeasures. The evacuation was proceeding ahead of schedule, with minimal losses to the withdrawing forces. The final evacuation run on February 7th completed one of the most successful withdrawal operations in military history. In 3 nights, the Japanese Navy had rescued over 10,000 troops from what appeared to be certain capture or death. American forces, advancing to positions they expected would be heavily defended, instead found empty bunkers and abandoned equipment. As documented in Eric Hamel's detailed account, Guadalcanal, Decision at Sea, the successful completion of Operation KE marked the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific theater. While the evacuation preserved trained manpower for future defensive operations, Japan had permanently lost the strategic initiative that had carried its forces across the Pacific to within striking distance of Australia. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal's conclusion rippled throughout both combatant nations. For the Americans, victory proved that Japanese forces could be defeated in extended campaigns requiring sustained logistical support. The industrial advantages that American planners had counted upon were finally translating into battlefield success, while American forces had demonstrated their ability to learn and adapt under combat conditions. For Japan, the evacuation represented more than tactical withdrawal. It marked the beginning of a long retreat that would continue until surrender in Tokyo Bay 30 months later. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through early war victories, had been permanently shattered in the jungles and waters around Henderson Field. The human cost of this strategic reversal defied easy calculation. Japanese losses on Guadalcanal exceeded 25,000 dead, while American casualties totaled over 7,000. Disease had claimed victims on both sides in numbers that rivaled battle casualties, while the psychological toll on survivors would influence military thinking for decades to come. Yet from this carnage had emerged proof that American industrial might, properly organized and led, could overcome any enemy regardless of their initial advantages in training or experience. The silence that descended over Henderson Field following the Japanese evacuation was almost eerie after 6 months of constant combat. Sergeant Mitchell walked through abandoned enemy positions, marveling at the ingenuity and determination that had created such formidable defensive works from nothing but jungle materials and human labor. The final American casualty count told the story of a campaign that had pushed both sides to their absolute limits. 7,000 American battle casualties, with thousands more evacuated due to disease, represented a price in blood that few had anticipated when Operation Watchtower began. Yet these losses had purchased something invaluable, proof that American forces could meet and defeat the Japanese Empire's finest military units in sustained combat. The strategic transformation accomplished at Guadalcanal extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Henderson Field had become the base for future Allied operations up the Solomon Islands chain, while the techniques developed during the campaign provided blueprints for island warfare throughout the Pacific theater. American industry, fully mobilized for the first time since the war began, was producing ships, aircraft, and weapons in quantities that dwarfed Japanese manufacturing capacity. More importantly, the campaign had forged a new generation of American military leaders who understood how to fight and win in the Pacific environment. Officers like Alexander Patch, Lewis Puller, and Willis Lee had learned hard lessons about jungle warfare, amphibious operations, and night naval combat that would prove invaluable in future campaigns. The institutional knowledge gained through trial and error at Guadalcanal would accelerate American victories at Tarawa, Saipan, and Okinawa. The psychological impact on both combatant nations was equally profound. American morale, shattered by the disasters of 1941 and early 1942, had been restored through victory against supposedly invincible enemies. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced the sobering reality that their early war successes had been based on temporary advantages that American industrial capacity would inevitably overcome. For the individual soldiers who survived the campaign, Guadalcanal remained a defining experience that shaped their understanding of warfare and human nature. They had witnessed acts of extraordinary courage and shocking brutality, often within minutes of each other. They had seen disease and death claim friends and enemies with equal indifference, while learning that survival often depended more on luck than skill or bravery. Mitchell, like thousands of other veterans, would carry these memories for the rest of his life. The steaming jungles, the screaming artillery, the faces of dead comrades, all would remain vivid decades later when other experiences had faded to mere shadows. But alongside the trauma came pride in having participated in a campaign that had changed the course of world history. The strategic lessons of Guadalcanal would influence American military thinking long after the Japanese surrender. The importance of air superiority, the vulnerability of extended supply lines, and the decisive role of industrial capacity in modern warfare all received validation through 6 months of brutal combat. Future campaigns would benefit from these insights, though each operation would present its own unique challenges and opportunities. Perhaps most significantly, Guadalcanal had demonstrated that democratic societies could fight and win extended wars against totalitarian enemies. The amateur soldiers and citizen sailors who had secured victory proved that free peoples, properly led and equipped, possessed reserves of strength that their enemies could never match. This lesson would prove equally relevant in future conflicts throughout the remainder of the 20th century. As American forces consolidated their hold on the Solomon Islands and prepared for the next phase of the Pacific War, they carried with them the confidence born of hard-won victory. Guadalcanal had been their apprenticeship in the arts of war. Everything that followed would build upon the foundation laid in the steaming jungles around Henderson Field. The epic campaign that had begun as a desperate gamble to seize a single airfield had evolved into the turning point of the Pacific War. America had proven it could win, and that knowledge would sustain its forces through all the trials that lay ahead on the long road to Tokyo Bay.